From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Thank you for coming. I'm Daniel Boomhower, the head of Reader Services here in the Music Division, and it gives me great pleasure to see you and to share some music from the library's collections. Before giving the talk per se, I want to thank several people for their assistance. Ray White provided a lot of help with the display of materials that we have on the east side of the room, and the staff in the Music Division's concert office has been fantastic, both in helping with just this program, but also all of our curator lectures. And then Daniel Walshaw has helped immensely on many details, especially bringing together this group of musicians to perform today. I instigated the Music Division's series of curator lectures 2 years ago with the objective of bringing to the attention of a broader audience not only the riches of the library's collections, but also the tremendous knowledge held by the staff who have the privilege of working with these collections on a daily basis. To date, we have had the opportunity to hear about the American composers Walter Piston, Carlisle Floyd, and Roy Harris, the multi-talented creator of the musical Rent, Jonathan Larson. We've heard about film music and sheet music from stage shows, about exhibits in the Performing Arts Reading Room, about the Russian Imperial Collection, about the Italian emigre in London, Muzio Clementi, and the German emigre in the United States, Arnold Schoenberg. This is a wide array of topics, but with the exception of the gallery talk given in conjunction with an exhibit highlighting the Dayton C. Miller Flute Collection, today's lecture treats music from the earliest period about which our curators have spoken. This, despite the fact that the Music Division holds materials in its collection that date to as early as the year 1100. As the scope of the previous curator lectures I mentioned begins to suggest, the breadth of the library's collections in music is quite impressive. To the extent that I can, I conduct research using these collections on music of Johann Sebastian Bach and on the reception of Bach's music in the period after his death in 1750. In the area of Bach studies, the Music Division does not disappoint, and to not disappoint you, I brought one of the treasures from the collection associated with Johann Sebastian Bach. But it should be said that the Library of Congress lags behind a number of other institutions whose holdings of autographed Bach sources are more numerous than what is found here. What I wish to discuss today, though, is an impressive trove of materials that shed light on music making contemporaneous with the last decade of Johann Sebastian Bach's life and the decades following that. Interestingly, the presence of sources documenting musical life in Berlin in the mid-18th century here at the Library of Congress offers a fascinating window into American culture at the beginning of the 20th century. Many of the items that illuminate the topic of chamber music in Berlin around 1750 were acquired by the Library of Congress between 1906 and 1913. That the architecturally magnificent Jefferson Building of the Library of Congress opened in 1897 and was hailed as the largest, safest, and costliest library in the world brings into focus the cultural ambition of the United States to be measured against the nations of Europe. Along with the creation of a monumental library building, the library actively collected historical European documents. This was especially true in the case of music following the appointment in 1903 of the American-born German-trained musicologist Oscar Sonic as the chief of the Music Division. Through Sonic's meticulous and voracious collecting, in the span of just a decade and a half, the library came to house a collection of music that bore comparison with the much older music collections found at the British Museum in London, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and the Prussian State Library in Berlin. Among the treasures Sonic managed to bring to Washington, one finds copies of 6 of the 8 items of music by J.S. Bach that were published during his tenure in Leipzig. These consisted almost entirely of keyboard compositions that over the course of the 1730s and 1740s became increasingly sophisticated in their compositional design. Indeed, several of these printed editions, including the Goldberg variations, the canonic variations on Vom Himmel hoch, the musical offering, and the art of fugue, present complex contrapuntal treatments in numerous movements of a single melodic phrase. It is the musical offering that serves today as the single most famous musical event of mid-18th century Berlin. In May of 1747, J.S. Bach traveled to Potsdam, accompanied by his eldest son, Wilhelm Friedemann Bach, presumably to visit the second eldest Bach son, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, who served as a harpsichordist in the musical establishment of the Prussian king, Frederick II, also known as Frederick the Great. It is from Wilhelm Friedemann Bach that we learn some of the circumstances of J.S. Bach's arrival in Potsdam, about 30 miles southwest of Berlin, in the early evening on May 7, 1747. Before even being able to change from his traveling clothes, the travel-weary composer was summoned by the king, who had surveyed the daily list of visitors to the court and noted the arrival of the Leipzig music director. The king, an accomplished flute player, had established at his court arguably the finest musical establishment in German-speaking lands at that time, in part to accompany his evening music making. Along with C.P.E. Bach, the king's musicians comprised an impressive group of younger composers actively cultivating a modern style of music imbued with more grace and clarity than that associated with the elder Bach, whose music had been criticized by some at the time as turgid. J.S. Bach, however, intrigued the young composer, or the young king, because of his renowned cultivation of learned counterpoint's antiquated musical complexities exemplified in the form of the fugue. Upon J.S. Bach's appearance at court, the king commanded that the composer and great keyboard virtuoso improvise a three-part fugue on a sophisticated chromatic theme that the king played for him at the keyboard. Upon fulfilling this request, the elder composer then played a six-part fugue at the keyboard on a different theme. The event must have been a success, as it proved striking enough for the king to recount its details decades later to the music-loving Habsburg ambassador to the Prussian court, Baron von Swieten, who would later introduce Bach's music to Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven. To be sure, though, Bach himself codified and expanded upon the musical particulars of this famous event in a printed edition of his contrapuntal treatment of the royal theme, which the composer titled Ein musikalisches Opfer, or a musical offering. To give you a sense of this music, I have the pleasure of performing for you some of it with a fine group of music students from the University of Maryland, Caitlin McSherry playing violin, just one, not two, Dan McCarthy playing viola, and Emily Cantrell also playing viola, and Gozde Yasar playing cello. Along with them, my music division colleague Dan Walshaw will play the theorbo, which is a member of the lute family of instruments that often doubled or took the place of a harpsichord. So, Mr. McCarthy is going to play for you the royal theme that was presented to Bach on which he was to improvise. In his printed edition of his treatment of the theme, Johann Sebastian Bach presented an engraved reproduction of his improvised three-part fugue, reproducing the fugue he had improvised before the king. And to this, he added a six-part fugue, now on the same theme, a trio sonata into which Bach weaves the theme among numerous other melodic ideas, and 10 canons on the theme. We will play for you now an excerpt from the six-part fugue from the musical offering, for which the original printed edition, for which in the original printed edition, Bach applied the somewhat archaic term Rischakar. And that is the Bach item that we brought today, is a copy, one of 14 copies, I believe, that survive of the original edition of the musical offering. there's more. As I mentioned, Johann Sebastian Bach's musical offering today overshadows all else that took place in the mid-18th century in this very musical court and city, perhaps for obvious reasons. However, while scholarship for many years portrayed a musical scene that initially flourished under the young king's patronage, the common account holds that during the 7 Years' War of the 1750s and in its aftermath, musical life in Berlin stagnated. Documents here at the Library of Congress and elsewhere, though, suggest something different. Musicologists have accurately related that Frederick the Great revived musical life in the Prussian court following the austere rule of his father, Friedrich Wilhelm I. However, in her recent Harvard dissertation, Ellen Exner corrects the notion that musical life in Berlin had ceased to exist prior to Frederick's coronation in 1740, offering as part of her evidence reference to the musical establishment maintained by the Margraves of Brandenburg, who retain their notoriety today because of the Brandenburg Concerti by J.S. Bach. The point is that though Friedrich Wilhelm did not support a significant musical retinue at his court, musical performance was actively cultivated in other aristocratic households in Berlin. One finds a similar historical misconception about the role of music in the education of the children of Friedrich Wilhelm. Despite suggestions to the contrary, Friedrich Wilhelm did not deprive his son of a musical education, nor did Prince Frederick the Great, have to pursue his musical interests in secret with his mother's protection. More accurately, it could be best said that Friedrich Wilhelm saw music as a frivolous expense for a kingdom only established one generation earlier and militarily precarious. Even still, during the last years of his father's reign, Frederick had begun an ambitious project to form a robust musical establishment at his princely residence. Steadily, Frederick hired musicians toward fulfilling his desire to utilize music in the representation of the state, an act of representation foregone by his father, but very well established as a hallmark of royalty throughout Europe, as most prominently enacted by Louis XIV of France. Indeed, Frederick's debt to France included, among other things, the Palace Sans-Souci, built between 1745 and 1747 and modeled after Louis XIV's palace at Versailles, and his patronage of the French philosopher Voltaire in the 1750s. Musically, the model for Frederick could be found much closer, at the Saxon court in Dresden, which had become famous both for its opera and church music. In 1728, at the age of 16, Frederick joined his father at a state visit to the Saxon court, an experience that greatly influenced the young prince's musical tastes. In fact, Frederick studied the flute with the Saxon court musician Johann Joachim Quantz, and later, after his ascension to the throne, Frederick lured Quantz to Berlin with a very lucrative salary. Prior to Quantz's arrival in Berlin, Frederick managed to hire several other Dresden musicians, and by 1736, had a musical retinue of as many as 17. In the display here, over there, you will see a salary receipt for several court musicians serving in Potsdam in the hand of Quantz, dated July 24, 1750. As the J.S. Bach episode demonstrates, nightly chamber music defined at least the early years of Frederick's reign, but it was through opera that Frederick sought to position music prominently in his assertion of Prussian significance on the European political stage. In 1742, Frederick's ambition to present opera in the model found in Dresden was realized with the opening of the Royal Opera House on Berlin's main avenue, Unter den Linden. The Opera House stood, in fact, as the only piece completed in a grand architectural project, the Forum Fredericianum, that the king had planned for construction at the east end of Unter den Linden. If completed, the Forum Fredericianum, designed by the architect Georg Wenceslaus von Knobelsdorff, who would later design Sans-Souci, the Forum would have been another clear public statement of Prussia's standing in Europe. While he would have liked to have plucked from Dresden its illustrious Kapellmeister, Johann Adolf Hasse, to promulgate opera in the Prussian capital, Frederick took on as his Kapellmeister Karl Heinrich Graun, the brother of one of his violinists, Johann Gottlieb Graun. In pursuit of his operatic ambitions, Frederick worked closely with his Kapellmeister, choosing the subjects of the operas to be composed, writing detailed scenarios, and on occasion drafting nearly complete libretti. In two items that we've brought from our collection and that are on display, we have evidence of Frederick's engagement with opera. In one instance, we have an entire aria composed by Frederick that was inserted into Karl Heinrich Graun's opera Demo Funte. And in the other instance, we have a full score of another Graun opera, Fatante, into which a score an aria composed by Frederick was inserted by a copyist. As we know, Frederick maintained a consistent routine of playing chamber music each evening. What music was performed in these evening gatherings is not clearly documented, though there is some anecdotal suggestion that only music by Quantz was performed on these occasions. However, a substantial body of chamber music composed by other musicians in Frederick's employ survives, including in the sizable collection of 18th century manuscripts held here at the Library of Congress. The two most prevalent forms of music heard at Frederick's evening gatherings were concerti, featuring a solo instrument, usually flute, and a small accompanimental ensemble, as well as trio sonatas, so called because they consisted of 3 distinct melodic lines. However, as you will see momentarily, or hear, trio sonatas were typically performed by at least 4 musicians. The 2 upper melodic lines were performed by some combination of flutes and violins, whether 2 flutes, 2 violins, or 1 of each, and functionally any of these combinations was acceptable. The bass line in a trio sonata would be performed by a melodic instrument such as cello, viola da gamba, or bassoon. The 4th instrument would play the bass line as well, but was more essential for providing the harmonic underpinning of the music through chords based on the bass line. This part would generally be performed on the harpsichord, but could be doubled or replaced by the theorbo. Since the library's harpsichord that is most appropriate for this role is on long-term loan to the National Gallery of Art, and because the theorbo is such an intriguing instrument, we have the pleasure of presenting that instrument here. We will play for you 2 movements from trio sonatas by composers working in Berlin. Conventional wisdom holds that the musicians at Frederick's court developed a style of composition markedly different than that of the music of J.S. Bach. Whereas J.S. Bach was known to write thick, intricate music, like we just heard, these younger composers sought to develop a lighter, simpler musical texture. As you will hear, though, the 2 examples which we will play show how the objective of creating intricate counterpoint could be accommodated within a less dense harmonic framework. Indeed, C.P.E. Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach's son, argued quite accurately that his father, in fact, accomplished this lighter texture in his own trio sonatas. The first example we will play comes from a trio sonata in G minor by a student of J.S. Bach, the composer Johann Philipp Kirnberger, and this particular movement is noteworthy for its clean flowing melodic line. I'd also like to dispel the notion that musical style had taken a marked turn away from the contrapuntal forms perfected by J.S. Bach. As the trio sonata, or the trio movement we will play now, suggests, contrapuntal forms were adapted to the new melodic imperatives of the galant style. This fugal allegro by Johann Gottlieb Graun adheres to the time-honored convention of writing counterpoint a la breve, which uses the half note, or breve, as the primary metrical unit. This style was particularly associated with sacred choral polyphony, as exemplified in the masses of the Dresden composer Jan Dismas Zelenka and in J.S. Bach's B minor Mass. Though one shouldn't read too much into this ground sonata is also in B minor. What is more significant is that, unlike the terse fugal subjects common in the music of J.S. Bach, the theme of this movement is quite long, similar in dimension to the royal theme on which Bach improvised before Frederick the Great. So we're going to play the second movement of the trio sonata in B minor. It's a fugue by Johann Gottlieb Graun. It should be noted that Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach also made substantial contributions to the trio and concerto repertoire of mid-century Berlin. Of further interest is the fact that C.P. Bach was just one of several students of J.S. Bach working at the court of Frederick the Great or elsewhere in Berlin. The other primary opera composer at the court, besides Karl Heinrich Graun, was Johann Friedrich Agricola, who studied with Bach in Leipzig while a student at the university from 1738 to 1741. In 1741, Agricola moved to Berlin and studied with Quantz before becoming a court composer. A noteworthy attribute of Berlin musical life at the time was the high level of theoretical engagement among the city's musicians, who produced quite a number of treatises on music. An early example is Quantz's 1752 essay on the playing of the transverse flute. In the following year, C.P. Bach published the first edition of his essay on playing the keyboard, which codifies many of the pedagogical methods of his father. Agricola published a treatise on singing in 1757. Another treatise writer in 18th century Berlin and Bach student from 1739 to 1741 was Johann Philipp Kirnberger, who would eventually serve Frederick's music-loving sister, Anna Amalia. Kirnberger, whose Siciliano we heard earlier, promoted the music of Johann Sebastian Bach tirelessly, developing an ardent devotee in Princess Anna Amalia, and explicating Bach's contrapuntal methods, most notably in his treatise, The Art of Strict Musical Composition, or Die Kunst des reinen Satzes in der Musik. It is true that the energy of musical life at Frederick's court dissipated during and after the 7 Years' War. While opera remained an important symbol of the state and of Frederick's authority, the early death of Frederick's Kapellmeister and primary opera composer Karl Heinrich Graun in 1759 is emblematic of musical affairs in Prussia. However, sufficient evidence exists to confirm active private musical salons held in the homes of the aristocracy and the emerging bourgeoisie throughout this period. Some of these private salons developed into standing, semi-public engagements with professional musicians from the court, usually performing. Examples include groups that went by the names of the Musikübende Gesellschaft, the Musikalische Assemblée, and the Privatkonzert. In another recently completed Harvard dissertation, Matthias Rüder observes many details of musical life in Berlin taking place outside of the court. As Rüder demonstrates, the early salons represented a kind of mirroring of courtly practices as both a form of homage and an act of cultural self-representation. As controls on public music making relaxed, performances also began to occur in restaurants, coffee houses, and public gardens, a transition documented by Rüder and the German scholar Christoph Hensel. The shift from salons to larger public spaces also promoted a shift in repertoire utilized, moving from smaller chamber music, such as the trio sonata, to orchestral pieces, oratorios, and even opera. Manuscripts in the music division's collections provide significant documentation of the musical activity of Berlin at this time. Among the manuscripts on display today, we have examples of chamber music copied by a close associate of Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, a figure long known to Bach scholars as Anonymous 300, and recently demonstrated by Peter Volney to be Johann Friedrich Hering. The example on display is the Kirnberger trio we played earlier, one of about 30 items in our collection in the hand of Johann Friedrich Hering. That this manuscript contains music by Kirnberger is significant as further evidence of the association of Kirnberger with Frederick's musicians and their activities outside of the court. The manuscript of the Johann Gottlieb Graun trio con fuga that we heard earlier bears the name Mengus on the lower right-hand corner of the wrapper, which likely documents previous ownership by a figure who Christoph Hensel has demonstrated to have presented public concerts in Berlin between 1766 and 1771, and is possibly the horn player Christian Mengus, who served in Friedrich's Kapelle up to the middle of 1757. Presently, we will perform for you the Sinfonia, or overture, from Karl Heinrich Graun's opera Fatante. The manuscript for this opera in the library's collection is interesting as it has been documented to be in the hand of an individual by the name of Holstein, who had at least on occasion been associated with the Musikübende Gesellschaft, the semi-public professional association performing for the aristocracy and upper bourgeoisie. The Sinfonia gives some sense of the galant musical style most closely associated with Frederick's court, and really most mid-18th century European courts. In it, you will hear gestures and textures that at least foreshadow the Viennese classicism of Haydn and Mozart. As observed in the Grove Dictionary of Music, the immediate antecedent of the modern symphony is commonly considered to be the opera sinfonia, which by the early 18th century had a standard structure of 3 sections or movements: a fast movement, a slow movement, and a fast dance-like movement. That form was extensively used by Alessandro Scarlatti and his contemporaries and was widely adopted outside of Italy, particularly in Germany and England. The terms overture and symphony or sinfonia were widely regarded as interchangeable for much of the 18th century. It is my pleasure to present for you the Sinfonia from Karl Heinrich Graun's Fatante, after which I will be happy to take questions or to discuss informally the materials we have on display. have time for questions if you have any. Yeah.
I'd be interested in knowing the tuning of the
Everybody always asks about the lute. So you have basically a scale on the low strings. That's just part of a C major scale, and then this is tuned like basically like a lute is, except a whole step lower and has a couple low notes on the end. So it's like a lute attached to or a bunch of big strings attached to a lute. So I don't actually fret any of these notes. These are just as they are. So that they are.
Yes.
Are we going to get back our harpsichord?
Oh, well, it's a very convenient arrangement. They use it often, and we have two other harpsichords, both of which belong to Wanda Landowska, but they're a much sturdier instrument than what would have been used in this period. They actually would have worked well to play, because we're all playing on modern instruments that are slightly different than the instruments that would have been used at the time. So we could have hung in there with Vanda's harpsichord, but then we'd have to get it in here, and it would have been complicated. And tune it. Harpsichords are a bear to tune.
But my question is, are we getting it, eventually get it back?
Well, it is the library's. So if we want it, we can get it back. I shouldn't have mentioned that. Any other questions? Well, I invite you to take a peek at some of the items that we brought over, and thank you again so much for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.